romantically involved with Dumb and Dumber co-star Lauren Holly.
They say never meet your heroes, and for Dave Chappelle, meeting Jim Carrey didn't just disappoint, it revealed something most people never see, something that doesn't show up on screens, doesn't appear in interviews the way you expect, doesn't match the version people carry in their minds, something that feels hidden in plain sight, because what looked like brilliance on the surface felt completely different up close, and the uncomfortable part is, what Chappelle experienced that day wasn't just strange, it was unsettling in a way he didn't expect, the kind of moment that lingers longer than it should, the kind that quietly forces a question most people avoid asking: what if the person you admire isn't the person you think you understand? And that contrast is where this story actually begins, not with success, not with fame, but with something far more uncomfortable. The gap between perception and reality, because for years, people didn't just admire Jim Carrey, they believed. They understood him, they believed the energy they saw on screen was who he really was, but what happens when that version doesn't match the person behind it? What happens when the performance doesn't stop when the cameras do, and continues in ways people don't expect? If you ask almost anyone to name one of the most wildly talented comedic actors ever, the answer comes instantly. Jim Carrey, not just because he was funny, but because of how he did it, the faces, the movement, the way his entire body seemed to transform before a single word even landed. It wasn't just comedy, it was something physical, something unpredictable, something that didn't follow structure, something that felt like it could collapse at any moment but somehow always worked. And this is where the contradiction begins to form more clearly, because the same intensity that made him iconic didn't always translate the same way off camera, and that difference is what most people never get to see, because what you see publicly is controlled, shaped, presented in a way that feels complete, but what happens privately reveals something else entirely, something less polished, something less predictable, and this is where that first moment with Chappelle starts to make even more sense. To understand where that difference begins, you have to go back, not to the fame, not to Hollywood, but to the version of him that existed before any of that. James Eugene Carrey, born in Newmarket, Ontario, into a working-class family where stability wasn't guaranteed, where routine existed but security didn't always follow. His mother, Kathleen, stayed home dealing with ongoing health struggles that affected daily life. His father, Percy, moved between music and accounting, trying to balance passion with responsibility, trying to provide something stable even when circumstances kept shifting around him, and on the surface, it looked ordinary. Structured, predictable, but even in that environment, something about him stood out early, something that didn't fit the structure around him, something that was already reacting differently to the world around him, something that would later define everything. At 8 years old, he wasn't just playing, he was studying, standing in front of a mirror, stretching expressions, testing how far he could push his face before it became something funny, something recognizable, something that created reaction, and that detail matters more than it seems, because it wasn't random, it was intentional, even at that age, because reaction meant something, reaction meant attention, and attention, in an environment where things feel unstable, becomes a form of control, something you can influence when everything else feels uncertain, and once you discover that, you don't let it go, you refine it, you repeat it, you depend on it, and slowly, without realizing it, it becomes part of how you exist, part of how you interact with people, part of how you regulate your environment. By 10, he wrote to Carol Burnett, convinced he had already mastered impressions, convinced he belonged in that world, and when a response came back, even if it was simple, even if it was expected, it didn't feel small, it felt like validation, like proof that what he was doing mattered, that it had direction, that it could become something more, and sometimes that's all it takes. One moment that turns imagination into belief, one signal that tells you this isn't just a phase, it's something real, and once that belief locks in, it becomes difficult to step away from it, it becomes something you carry forward. But while that belief was growing, everything else around him was starting to break. His family's financial situation didn't just decline, it collapsed, slowly at first, then all at once, forcing them to move repeatedly, trying to hold on to something stable, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, until eventually, there was nothing left to hold on to. They lost their home completely, and suddenly, life changed from structured struggle to raw survival, and survival doesn't give you time to think, it forces you to react, to adapt, to carry weight earlier than you should, and this is where something deeper starts forming, something that doesn't disappear later, something that stays beneath everything that follows. At one point, they were living in a Volkswagen van, not temporarily, not as a short phase, but as a reality they had to accept, sleeping in a tent near Lake Ontario, working overnight factory shifts just to maintain some level of income. And this is where the story shifts in a way most people don't fully understand, because these experiences don't just pass, they stay, they embed themselves into how you think, how you respond, how you define safety, how you react to uncertainty, and more. Importantly, how far you're willing to go to escape it, and that imprint doesn't fade easily, it carries forward into every decision. And that's where something important happens, because when you grow up watching stability disappear, you don't just want success, you need it, not for validation, but for security, and that difference changes everything. It changes the intensity behind every decision, it changes the pressure behind every opportunity, it changes how you experience both failure and success, and this is where that internal drive begins, not from ambition alone, but from something deeper, something rooted in experience, something that doesn't switch off easily. When his father finally found work again, it came with long hours, physical demands, and the expectation that Jim would contribute, working as a janitor, moving through environments that didn't match his age, didn't match what life was supposed to look like at that stage, and that disconnect builds pressure, it creates awareness, it creates a need to find something else, something different, something that feels like a way out. And through all of that, one thing remained constant, comedy. Because it was the only place where something shifted, where pressure eased, where control returned, even briefly, and that's why he didn't let it go. When he first stepped onto a stage at 15, it didn't go the way people imagine, it wasn't applause, it wasn't recognition, it was rejection, immediate, uncomfortable, the kind that forces you to question everything, and for most people, that would have been enough to stop, enough to walk away. But this is where his story separates, because failure wasn't new. He had already experienced instability at a deeper level, so instead of stopping, he returned, adjusted, refined, and this is where repetition under pressure begins to build something stronger than confidence. It builds resilience, something that doesn't disappear when things go wrong, something that stays even when outcomes don't match expectations. Over time, small opportunities became consistent work became recognition, recognition created momentum, and once momentum begins, it becomes difficult to stop, because it creates proof that effort leads somewhere, proof that direction matters, proof that persistence isn't wasted even when it feels invisible in the moment, proof that even the smallest steps are building toward something larger than you can see at the time, and even then, rejection didn't disappear. Including from major platforms like Saturday Night Live, a moment that could have changed everything instantly, but didn't, and instead of breaking him, it redirected him, forced him to build outside traditional systems, forced him to develop something unique, something that didn't rely on approval, something that stood on its own, something that couldn't be easily filtered or controlled by expectations, something that existed independently of validation and therefore couldn't be taken away by it. And that difference became his advantage, because when he finally broke through in the 1990s, it didn't happen gradually, it exploded. Ace Ventura? The Mask. Dumb and Dumber, performances that didn't just succeed, they dominated, they reshaped expectations, they created something people hadn't seen before, something that felt unpredictable and impossible to replicate, something that stood out even in an industry built on repetition. And from the outside, it looked like everything worked, like the system delivered exactly what it promised, like success solved everything, like the destination matched the dream perfectly, like every struggle had been worth it in a clean and complete way, but internally, something didn't match, something remained unresolved, something that success couldn't fully reach, something that didn't disappear even as everything else improved. Because this is where the story turns again, because success doesn't always resolve what's underneath. Sometimes it amplifies it, sometimes it exposes it, sometimes it makes it louder instead of quieter, sometimes it removes distractions and leaves you face to face with what was always there, and this connects back to that first moment again, because what Chapelle experienced wasn't random, it was a glimpse into something deeper, something that had been building for years, something shaped long before the success arrived, something that success simply revealed instead of created. Because when identity becomes tied to performance, when the world expects a version of you, maintaining that version becomes pressure, and over time, that pressure changes you, reshapes you, slowly separates what you feel from what you show, until the difference between the two becomes harder to ignore. And that's where things begin to blur, because at some point, the performance stops being something you do, and starts becoming something you are, and when that happens, the line between who you are, and who people expect you to be, begins to fade, begins to overlap in ways that are difficult to control, and that overlap creates tension between authenticity and expectation, between internal reality and external perception, and that's what makes that encounter so uncomfortable, because it reveals something most people never consider: the cost of becoming something the world recognizes, the cost of being seen, the cost of being defined by something you once chose, the cost of not being able to easily return to who you were before it all began. And if you've followed this far, you're not just watching a story anymore, you're recognizing a pattern, not just in him, but in how success is often misunderstood, in how people chase outcomes without understanding the internal trade-offs, in how the external reward doesn't always align with the internal experience. And if that perspective is something you want more of, then subscribing isn't just about staying updated. It's about continuing to see what most people overlook, because there is always more happening beneath the surface than what you see at first, and once you start seeing it, it becomes difficult to ignore, almost impossible to unsee, something that changes how you interpret not just this story, but others like it. And maybe that's what makes this story different, not the success, not the fame, but what happens after, because what looks complete from the outside can feel unfinished from within, can feel disconnected from what you expected it to be, can feel like something is still missing even when everything appears present, and that's the part most people never talk about, the part that doesn't get highlighted, the part that remains hidden behind the narrative of achievement. And the moment you understand that, everything starts to look different, not just this story, but every story that follows the same pattern, every version of success that seems complete until you look closer, until you question what's actually beneath it.